recording. And, all right. Testing 1, 2, 3. All right. This is Ryan Dearbone, and today I'm joined by Dr. Larry Snyder, who is the Professor Emeritus of History of Religion at Western Kentucky University and a former dean at Western. Good to have you here today.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here.
And so as we've talked, obviously we've known each other for several years, and we've talked at length over the past few weeks about this podcast and kind of religion and the changeover of what it will look like or what it's looking like now post-pandemic. So I just want to start by asking you, and this is probably a big question to get started with, but I think it might be a good starting point. The way we've seen, or the way we're seeing religion shift in post-pandemic, with it being more virtual, being more open door, is this maybe one of the bigger changes or bigger transitions in religion that we've seen? Because I know you've studied religion. Would you consider this to be one of the bigger changes that religion has seen?
Well, I think we definitely are in a major transition in religious life, practice, belief in the United States, and globally for that matter. The pandemic, from my perspective, only sort of exacerbated or accelerated trends and inclinations that were already there. Folks have been tracking for a number of years sort of the change in religious affiliation. And a new book has come out fairly recently about the great de-churching in America. And the pandemic, by forcing us all back to our houses on Sunday mornings and watching virtually for a year and a half or so, I mean that has contributed, but that's not the whole story. It's just one factor in all of this. And we have seen now for a couple of decades a shift away from church attendance, religious membership and identity. And we're sort of seeing it play out now in the aftermath of the pandemic, where new options were forced to emerge. You know, you're going to go home, you're going to sit on your couch, drink coffee, and you're going to watch the service as opposed to being there. We've already been seeing sort of things move in that direction, but the pandemic only accelerated it.
And so you brought up the point of the pandemic has kind of really blown open the doors to what was already happening.
Yeah.
I know growing up, it used to be that online or television religion kind of was more segmented to your Kenneth Copelands,
mm-hmm.
your Joel Osteens, the people that had the big mega churches.
Right.
And they were able to promote their message through the airwaves, something that, a small church didn't have because obviously you just didn't have the money, the inclination to do it. How do you think that has put, I won't say regular churches, but churches that are smaller, that only maybe, you might have a church that has 100 members. How has that put them on the same level as those more conglomerate churches, or is there still a difference between now that they have this ability to do basically what a church like Kenneth Copeland's might have done?
Well, I think you're right. The effect of the pandemic was to democratize all of that. Almost any small church, or medium or large church for that matter, now has the ability to use Facebook Live or any number of platforms to broadcast. And you don't need a whole lot of technology to do so. And the availability of Wi-Fi means that folks in rural communities, if they can't make it to their church, they can still tune in. And you didn't have that before. It required lots and lots of money to do those broadcasts, and only those large churches, mega churches, and TV preachers had the means to do so. But it's been democratized in the sense that all churches have the ability to do this now. And the effect is it has allowed them to to hold on to members who might have sort of drifted away during the pandemic. But the flip side is folks have realized, oh, I can be a member and I don't necessarily have to be there physically on a Sunday morning.
Yeah.
And you're beginning to see, some regularizing of church attendance for those churches. But it's an open question as to whether it's ever going to get back to pre-pandemic numbers. And I'm of the mind it probably is not.
And so I've heard several pastors and people talk about church hurt and that being a potential reason why people don't come back because they don't, and you kind of alluded to it. You can be a member of a church but not have to deal with the daily goings on of the church, whether that's good things or bad things. You can take a passive stance and just get the good parts, I guess, if you want to get the sermon, if you want to get the singing or the pomp and circumstance, but not have to be there. Talk a little bit from your study, your experience, church hurt, and how that you think might contribute to this new wave of people not wanting to be in church or being a part of church as it used to be constructed.
Right. Well, I mean, there's been church hurt as long as there have been churches. My New Testament scholar colleagues sort of will talk about those kinds of challenges in the early Christian movement. It's nothing new. It's just it changes address and locale. But one thing we've noticed, particularly over the last 2 decades, for 25 years maybe, scholars have referred to this as the rise of the nuns. And that's a reference to pollsters who will ask folks, well, what's your religious identification? And folks increasingly will say, well, none, right? And, for years and years and years, that number was pretty stable, down actually below 10%. When I started teaching here, back when the dinosaurs still roamed, that number had been pretty stable for about 50 years, really. But over the last 25 years, that number has slowly creeped up. Then all of a sudden, it's really accelerated, so that now the number of Americans who would identify as none when asked which is your religious identification, is anywhere from 30 to 33%, about a third of Americans, depending upon which poll you're looking at. In that number is a good number of folks who have what you've described as church hurt. You have an increasing number of folks who will identify as agnostic or even atheist, but that number is still, relatively small. The big number in there are folks who say, well, I'm spiritual but not religious. That is, they continue to believe in God or a higher power of some sort, but they won't identify as Christian or Buddhist or Roman Catholic or whatever. They're just not going to identify. But they still see themselves as being spiritual beings, and they still believe in lots of things. They may even believe in most of the creeds of a particular tradition, but they just do not belong. And then when you press a little bit further, you ask, well, why not? Right? And among the rise of the nuns, those who have done the research point out a couple of factors. One, it's simply become more socially acceptable over the past 25 years to not belong. Mid 20th century, belonging to a church, a synagogue, was a way of demonstrating your Americanness. That's changed. And it's more socially acceptable now than it was for folks not to belong and not to show up on a Saturday or a Sunday for a church service or synagogue or temple service. But the other factor that has sort of been demonstrated by pollsters here is that a good number of folks who have left say that one thing that they're uncomfortable with is the increasing politicization of religion. And those who have left, more often than not, tend to lean left. And they say Christianity in America has become increasingly dominated by folks on the far right of the political spectrum, and that's not what I want. So those folks have left, and in part it's this religious church hurt, as you put it. And over the past, couple of years, there's been a lot of talk about folks who are deconstructing their religious identity and deconstruction of religion. And most folks using that term are talking about going back and trying to understand where they came from and how they got here. And why is it that there is some kind of basic racism in my church tradition that I really wasn't aware of for a very long time, but now I see it? Or why are LGBTQ plus people excluded like they are? I don't support that. Why is that basic to my tradition? So a number of those folks have left. Some of them have found new spiritual homes in other places. Others have simply said, I'm going to be a good American and do it on my own. That whole individualistic ethic applied to religion in America is a very strong impulse. So there's a whole category of folks out there who describe themselves as ex-evangelicals, and they've got websites and podcasts and so forth. And many of them would use and describe church hurt as one of the factors leading to their decision.
Wow, that's ex-evangelicals. That's interesting.
It is.
And as you were talking, it made me think, now there are options.
Yeah.
Before, either you dealt with it. It's like one of those things, people say, well, when I was a kid, I didn't have an option. I just did what was told to me. So you just went to church. You didn't question it. Like you said, that was part of your identity. Now you can make the choice to not do it or do it however you want to. So let me ask you this. When looking at the people who are not going back, I know some people will say, I'm not going back because I'm still fearful of the pandemic or of disease or whatever, anything like that. Some people say it's for comfort because they can watch service. They can still be a part of the church without actually being a part of the church, or they can be experimenting with a bunch of different churches, different religions, all at once, sit on your couch and watch 5 different services on a Sunday morning. Is that weakening, in your opinion? Does that weaken religion or weaken somebody's ability to be a devout religious person because they're not actively physically engaged with a church or their church, but they're more, it's almost like a buffet. I'm going to eat a little bit of everything without actually committing to one meal type thing?
Well, I mean, it certainly does weaken religious identity and commitment in the conventional sense. And we have always, understood religion as belonging to a community. And community implied physical presence, right? As we have moved into a more digital age, the thing is, these folks are still finding religious community. It's just being reshaped and reformulated. Religion itself is incredibly malleable. It changes, it shifts, and religion's fine, but the older versions of it are experiencing a great deal of transition and even stress. Those churches, and I keep saying churches, but this loss of attendance, for example, is not restricted to Christianity. In the United States, 50% of those who would identify as religiously Jewish don't attend. 50% of Buddhists. And this is a number that has increased, right? So this is not restricted to Christianity. It's religion across the board in the modern era. And so what, scholars are trying to figure out is, okay, well, how are folks reformulating religion, or how is religion being reformulated? How are folks finding and sustaining new communities of faith and belief in this new era? So it's not that religion's going away. It looks very different than it has in the past. But for institutions, churches that have been built and sustained over generations in that traditional model, it's a real challenge to figure out how to do this in a way that is faithful to the past, yet open to the needs of the present. But you might say it's always been the challenge.
And it's kind of interesting looking at it from the prospect of you could go back and look at a church roster and see how many members you have. So you might have 200 people on the roster. Now, with that social media virtual aspect, you can't quantify. I mean, you could probably look on YouTube and say you have 300 views, but how many of those are members? How many of those are transients who are going through and looking at it? But you can't quantify now a membership and say, okay, we have 500 members because we have 300 that watch online, 200 that attend in person, which makes it a very open space.
Of course, the flip side of that is you might say, the difference between names on a roster, membership roster, and those who are actively participating on a regular basis, there's always been a huge gap, right? What this has done by bringing in digital worship services is perhaps some of those folks who had not been attending and were never going to attend physically, now some of them are tuning in. And so it's just, but you're right, it's almost impossible to quantify. It makes it very difficult. Folks are still trying to figure out whether, or put differently, still trying to figure out how much the pandemic and this shift is affecting church giving, for example, religious giving and philanthropic giving generally. On the one hand, digital access means it's a lot easier to just push a button and donate some money, right? And you don't necessarily have to be there to put it in the offering plate. So financial giving made it through the pandemic pretty well, all things considered. And maybe that's a better measure in a capitalist society like the United States as to religious commitment as opposed to attendance. I don't know.
So let me ask you this question. I'd posed this to another person who I talked to. With us being in such a virtual space, do you see churches or religious institutions getting to a point where brick and mortar church buildings or temples will no longer be necessary, no longer be utilized because someone theoretically could start a church and it be completely virtual? And they do everything they want to do virtually without the necessity of an actual building in which to contain the church. Do you see us getting to that point with everything changing so rapidly? Or do you think there will always be, at least to some degree, a need for a physical space to represent religion and church?
Well, I tend to think there's always going to be the physical presence. There certainly will be more emphasis on the digital, an expansion of the digital, more use of that. But, I mean, religion at its core is about binding not just individuals to whatever divine being they happen to be worshiping, but it's about binding people together. And religions build community. And frankly, given the way we're designed and the way we work, physical presence and connection to one another is really important to make things work over the long haul. Groups are going to come and go, particularly if they're online. But this is my feeling is that the sustaining element in all of that is the sense of community and the building of community. And while that is changing, I just don't think human beings are ever going to get away from the need to rub elbows with someone and have that. Furthermore, religions that survive build upon and use common symbols and elements to bind them together. Architecture is one of those things that human beings do very, very well. And religions have done very, very well because that architecture itself comes to symbolize something for people. It becomes a place of belonging and a place of identity. So I'm not of the opinion that we're going to ever sort of get past the need for brick and mortar. There's going to be less of it. And institutions are going to have to figure out how to work in a world in which brick and mortar is not the sum total. But I don't see a time when there's going to be nothing like that. I mean, heck, Amazon now has got brick and mortar stores for that matter. I mean, they started one way and went the other. So, it's a little bit of give and take.
And I remember, it seemed like when I was growing up for a time, there were like one church would build, like either they'd upgrade their building, and then another church would have to try to keep up. And so church got a little bit bigger or a little bit fancier. And even to that turn, looking at, one church would do something, one pastor might preach this way, so another pastor would try to compete.
Sure.
But if I went to church A and you went to church B, we would never know what the other church was like, what the sermon was. You'd never hear it because you're in one church versus another church. Now it seems, and this is just my take on it, because you can watch all these different services with all these different preachers, there could be a level of competition.
Sure.
Of watching what the other church is doing or what this other pastor is preaching. So your content matches up or is in some way as good as what this other pastor is. Because now it's almost like watching a TV show. It's watching channels. What's going to compel the audience to come to my church? Is it the graphics? Is it all the bells and whistles we do online? Is it the content? So how do you see that kind of changing the way religion now is looking? Do you see kind of that same formula?
Well, that is the story of American religion. It's religion in a capitalist society. And particularly as you sort of look at sort of the post-revolutionary era in America, we, unlike countries in Europe, did not have a state church. Right? It was not, we didn't have, federal dollars going to support the Church of America. And what happens is it becomes a free market religious economy in America. And those institutions who were able to tap into the needs and the wants of people out there in the cities and on the frontier, those are the ones who did exceptionally well. Methodists in the early part of the 19th century, by about 1820, the structure for the Methodist Church was larger than that of the federal government. I mean, they had figured out how to reach people and to grow. Baptist churches, particularly on the frontier, figured out their decentralized approach to religion really worked, and they were able to grow and to flourish. And so American religion has always adapted to this kind of free market religious economy. And this is just another iteration of that. We're now in a digital market, and the churches and religious institutions that survive and grow are going to be the ones who figure out how to do that. I mean, purists might say, well, this is about truth and it's about, well, okay, but the reality is for people, they go where they feel that their needs are being met, that they are able to find a sense of community and something that nourishes their spiritual longing. Wherever that is, however that is, that's where folks are going to go. And the religious institutions that figure out how to do that are going to be the ones that continue to grow.
And so the ones that don't meet that need, meet the feed the need of those people, do you think they will they perish, or will they end up, I don't know, do you think they will eventually adapt, or they will just fade away like some of the churches that didn't decide to go virtual during the pandemic?
There will be both. There will be the so-called mainline churches, which was a phrase popular in the 20th century, described those kind of main Protestant institutions, the Episcopal Church, the United Methodist Church, the Lutheran Church, for example. Those churches have been hemorrhaging members for the past 50 years. But not all of them. It tends to be localized. And those individual congregations or regions that figure out how to hit the right mark their constituents, their parishioners, are doing fine. But you either adapt or you die. And that kind of evolutionary law applies to religion in the same way it applies to anything else. And adaptation is essential if you're going to survive. And the problem facing religion today is that society, and it's not just American society, but globally, the society and cultural values are changing so quickly, and communication techniques are changing so quickly. It is a real challenge to keep up and to figure out how to get your message out there in the most effective way possible. And so it's always been the case, but we live in a speedy world, and it's just hard.
And you had sent me an article talking about Gen Z versus baby boomers,
right,
and how more Gen Z are actually interested in religion than the baby boomers are, which it was surprising to me, because I would think, baby boomers grew up in church. That's what they know. This is, like you talked about, part of their identity. Where Gen Z, at least as it's portrayed out in the media, out in the world, that their religion it's either a hindrance, it's something you put in your back pocket, use it if you need it, but it's not of high value. So I was really shocked by that. And especially looking at it now with this virtual component, there is an option that, you could be as into religion and all of that as you want, but never step a single foot in a church. Mm-hmm. And that was eye-opening to me. So when you saw that article, did that surprise you? Well,
a little bit. I was surprised by the numbers were as strong for Gen Z as they were. And of course, what was interesting about that particular study was that it was a global study. They looked at 26 different countries. And so that's not just a phenomenon in the United States. It's a global fact. Again, you have to sort of look at the boomer generation, which grew up in the wake of World War II, went through the trauma of the 60s, the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, and a lot of folks in that generation really began to move away from conventional religion, at least, in their 20s and 30s. Many of them came back when they started having kids. Right. But their connection to their traditional religious upbringing was weakened, if not broken. And many of those folks came back, but many of them didn't. So what you're finding, though, with Gen Z is these folks are still attracted to religion because religion speaks to something innate in human life. It speaks to a need for answers about the most profound questions that we face as human beings. And so Gen Z is more religious and has higher rates of belief in a higher power, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're all running back to the Methodist Church or the Episcopal Church or the Baptist Church. They're finding their religious communities in different places, and sometimes they're virtual.
So there's always this conversation, always just been this belief of a church without walls. Yeah. That church should not be confined to the four walls of a building. I think over the years, we've kind of siloed ourselves into that. Yeah. Like my church, we have an outreach ministry, sure, which, by definition, the whole church, everything should be outreach. It should be outwardly facing as opposed to just an inwardly facing, everyone who's in here is being saved, they're going to heaven or whatever the belief system is. And then the people outside, we just got to bring them in.
Right.
Does the virtual mechanism now create that church without walls that people have preached about and talked about for years, because there is literally no walls and there is nothing that stands between the quote unquote sinner and the quote unquote saint?
Mm-hmm. Well, yes and no. I would say yes, in the sense of how the outreach is occurring and how the community is being sustained, but there is still the we'll call it a wall of how you actually belong to the community. And if, in fact, churches, let's stick with churches for a moment, particularly on the evangelical side, continue to keep a kind of high wall of how do you identify, what do you require for true membership? What do you require for your understanding of what it means to be saved, for example, to use that language? The higher you build that wall, the greater the sense of commitment to it. It's harder to get in, but it's also harder to get out because folks have climbed that wall and put a lot of stress and effort in getting in. But that also makes it harder for folks to leave. If it's a very mushy kind of way of coming in, it's also a mushy way of going out, and folks can sort of move in and out. So that's where the trick is going to be for communities to figure out where's that sweet spot, you might say, for membership and identity. But we've always had folks who've been on the margins. They've always been there, right? It's just the conversation is a little bit different now.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah. The other one we haven't talked about is kind of the counter trend to all of this.
Yes.
And that is the fact of immigration, or what folks refer to as the globalization of American Christianity, is a counter trend to everything we just discussed. The majority of immigrants that come to the United States of any single group are by and large Christian, although they may be coming from South Korea or Guatemala, right? And we also know that a goodly number of folks who come here as immigrants then join immigrant-led groups, and they have a much stronger sense of physical community, from what we can tell, than what we've been discussing up to this point. And their sense of religious belonging is different. It's also by and large, when it comes to matters of doctrine, comes to matters of personal and public morality, tends to be more conservative. And so it is a counter trend to this kind of secularization that we've been discussing in some ways of American religion. And, you know, by the next 20 years or so, about 30% of the American population is going to be Latino, right?
Yeah.
And that is going to have it's already having a profound effect on American religious sensibilities and practice. And so the effect of the sort of the globalization of Christianity is really interesting to watch, because, you know, the average Christian in the world now is brown-skinned, female, and lives south of the equator.
Wow.
Right? You know, up until 1900, the majority of Christians living in the world were in the northern hemisphere, either North America or Europe. That's completely shifted. And Christianity is growing rapidly in sub-Saharan Africa and in Asia. Some have suggested that by 2060, I think, China will have the largest concentration of Christians in the world. Wow. Now, what's that going to mean?
That's a good question.
I mean, 60% of the Anglicans right now, those who belong to the Church of England, live in Africa. And they are exerting pressure on their church structure, which often is much more conservative theologically and in terms of sort of public and private morality than we've seen in the West. So we've got this counter trend going on, and it really remains to be seen how that's going to play out, which is, I got to say, one reason I enjoy studying religion, because it is infinitely interesting and it's constantly changing. And anyone who has predicted, and there have been lots of them, said, well, this is the death knell of religion in America. Well, they've all been wrong.
Right.
And again, part of it is that religion speaks to a fundamental need in human life, for better or for worse, sometimes both. Those religions that survive figure out how to do it, and they adapt. Every generation adapts and changes. And that's the genius of it.
I like you talking about the counter trend. So that basically you're going to have two headbutting. You're going to have the virtual side that's all people know and they've got accustomed to, versus the ones that hole up into a church or a synagogue because that's what they know and believe to be true. That's going to be interesting.
Well, it's really interesting, and particularly see how it plays out on the political front, because particularly progressive Christians, progressive religious folks in America, have traditionally been on the side of immigration. They have aligned themselves with civil rights causes and elimination and all of which is to the good. But many of those folks who are coming here would not agree with them on a lot of the moral issues. On the flip side, conservatives keep talking about all of these family values, and that's great, except many of the folks who are coming here really have a very different understanding of immigration and of civil rights. So it's going to really be interesting to see how these things play out, because the nature of society, American society, is changing. 2016 book, which I think is really good, it's worth everyone reading, is by Robert P. Jones. It's called The End of White Christian America. And white Christian America has dominated our religious imagination, cultural imagination for, 250 years. It's dying. And it's dying primarily because of demographic changes. And what comes in its place is what we're looking at, trying to figure out now.
And now you brought up a point that I want to touch on real quick. When it comes to the politicizing of religion.
Yeah.
A pastor could say something very political in his pulpit, and it stayed in that pulpit, it stayed in that church.
Yeah.
Now with this, they could say it and it goes viral. It goes anywhere, it goes everywhere. Do you think that pastors, religious figures now are understanding that power that they have and either choosing to mute themselves because they don't want to become a viral sensation one way or the other? Or are they using that, using that pulpit as their political standpoint to say, this is how we feel in this religion or in this church. We support this candidate or we support this, because it seems like I've seen more videos where pastors have decided to take that stance of, okay, now that we have a more broad, global, wide ranging audience, I'm going to dig my sword in the sand right here. And this is how we feel at this church. And this is how I feel as the pastor, and push it out there. Do you think that's contributing to the politicizing of religion? And is that going to continue?
I think so. I mean, particularly those who are savvy, have figured out, given their personal demographics or their church demographics, what it is that sells. I hate to use that term. It sounds pejorative, and I don't mean it to be. But they figure out what works. And if they can get a really hot tweet out there from a phrase they used in their sermon on some hot button issue, that can be useful, right? Yeah. It can also be damaging. Yeah. And so folks who are savvy are figuring out how to use it effectively. It's a strange new world for folks in the pulpit these days. Yeah.
It would. Thankfully, I'm no pastor. That's not my calling. But it would scare me in a way, just because of the thought now that if you have a wave of consciousness while you're in the pulpit. It used to be if you said something that people didn't like, it was in that room.
Right.
Maybe it might make it out. A few people say, well, pastor said this, and I didn't particularly care for it, but there was no record of it. But now once it's out there on live stream, once it's out there on social media, it is completely out there. And it's almost like we see people, they tweet something 10 years ago. Now it comes back to bite them when they get a high office or something like that. Now all of a sudden, well, you said this 10 years ago. It's out there in the ether. It can't go away one way or the other, or your church is now branded by what you say.
Right.
And even if your members don't agree with you and don't believe the same thing you believe, because your face is associated with that church, it's now you are basically speaking for your members, which can create a good and a bad, depending on, I guess, like you said, who's in that sanctuary, virtual or in person.
Well, I do have a good story about that.
I want to hear that.
I can't remember the year now, so it would have been, 2008, maybe? So it was when Hillary Clinton was running and she ended up losing to Barack Obama.
Okay.
And so it was when Obama was elected, so about 2008. So she attended church here in Bowling Green.
Yeah.
Right? And she's a lifelong Methodist, active in the Methodist Church. And so she showed up at the large United Methodist Church on a Sunday morning, and folks are driving up and they see all these guys in black suits and, earphones. It was really kind of strange. Go in and sit down, and she's sitting in about the fourth row. Right. And it was a little weird, but it was fine. But the pastor that Sunday, of course, he's had his sermon, in the can here for, a week already.
Right.
Well, it just happened to be that the reading for that Sunday and the sermon was from the Sermon on the Mount and about divorce and adultery.
Wow.
And of course she's sitting, but what was interesting was, reporters showed up, and then it became a national story that this Methodist pastor had preached a sermon against adultery and sort of called Hillary Rodham Clinton out and da-da-da. Of course, it was nothing like that, but it became this thing, right? And the pastor ended up getting all these emails, for and against. It was just a sermon he had already prepared. Should have going to be there.
Right.
But I hate to think about how that would have played today when folks were live tweeting that thing, and a particular passage or a comment made out of context could have been used. Right. That would have been a really different kind of event, right?
Wow, I think that would be national news within like 30 minutes.
Maybe even not 30 minutes. It would have just been, and it would have been splashed everywhere. Yeah. The immediacy of our communication has changed things dramatically, and that's for both good and bad. And so. But anyway, that's one of my favorite stories.
I like that. Again, that's why I leave pastoring to pastors,
right?
Who could take on that task.
Poor guy. It was just, you could tell he goes, "Oh Lord," it was a challenge, but he got through it.
Well, so let me ask you this question. It kind of feeds into that. With the new social media push and understanding of this is what we're looking like now. Some might argue that it steals away some of the soul of religion, because for a Catholic service where you go through certain pomps and circumstance of communion, of going through these different procedures, to have it live streamed or filmed or taped, or even you have to restage it because you have to put a camera here to catch this or catch that, or even just when somebody gets up and feels the spirit. Now it feels, does it change the soul of a service? Because now it's no longer an intimate service for those who attend, but now it's a
commodity that you watch.
Exactly. It's no different than watching Survivor or American Idol, something like that. Does that strip away some of the soul of religion or service?
Again, as I said, religion adapts. But for a Roman Catholic Christian, physically partaking of the Eucharist is not just recommended, it's essential. You can't do that virtually. right? You
Right.
have to be there
Right.
to physically take the wine and take the wafer. And you can't replicate that virtually. This kind of arrangement works better for Protestants who have de-emphasized the sacraments and emphasized preaching and the word and so forth. So it works better for Protestants than it does for those liturgically oriented religious traditions. And again, that wouldn't simply be, Catholic Christians. That could be any number of traditions,
Right.
Even non-Christian ones.
Right.
So it's gonna vary depending upon the tradition and what it is that sets that traditional experience apart and makes it unique.
Wow. It's a good conversation.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to bring you back at some point.
Okay.
And we will talk some more.
Sounds good.
So, but we've been talking with Dr. Larry Snyder, Professor Emeritus of History of Religion at Western Kentucky University and former dean there as well. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Enjoyed it as always.
I appreciate it.